post anonymously if you like, but everyone else will be able to see them, and you can then vote on which questions you want to see asked to the panel towards the end of the presentation. So I really recommend, even if you haven't got a question yourself, it's really worth going to that link just to vote up what you think is going to be interesting to ask. For those of you that don't know much about the SIU, we're an organization looking to bridge the gap between academia and industry. We do that through events like this today, where we have experts at the cutting edge of their field offer their time to come and talk to you, to kind of give you different perspectives on innovative and interesting scientific topics. And we also regularly publish articles on various scientific topics, aiming to increase public awareness and understanding on a wide range of developments and achievements in the scientific community. And without any more plugging of SIU, I'm just going to pass it straight over to our first speaker, which is Kamar, who is from, she's a computer vision engineer from Third Eye Intelligence. Kamar, if you'd like to take it away, I'll stop.
Thank you. All right. All right, I hope you can all see my screen. Hello, everyone. My name is Kamar, and I'm a computer vision engineer at Third Eye Intelligence. So let me start by telling you a little bit more about myself. Prior to joining Third Eye, I was pursuing a master's degree in human and biological robotics at Imperial College. And one of the health tech projects that I previously worked on, and I'm very proud of, is actually my master's thesis, which you can see on the right side of the screen. And what you essentially see here is a robotic device that aims at helping people with upper limb neuromuscular problems perform tasks independently, like eating and drinking. And the way that works is through an object detection and tracking system, which I worked on and improved, that the robot is able to automatically reach for and grasp different objects. And this is briefly my experience at Imperial. Shortly after I graduated, I joined Third Eye, and today I am very happy that I got this opportunity to talk to you guys about what I'm currently doing. So at Third Eye, our aim is to predict organ failure before onset so that we can save millions of lives every year. Our founders realized that this is a huge problem because every year, 85 million people are admitted to the ICU, and around 50% of them die. And the costs associated with treating them are well over $1 trillion. So we end up not only having a health problem, but an economic problem as well. But actually, it turns out that early intervention can save many of these lives and consequently reduce these additional costs. To address this, we created an early warning system by pioneering an evolving AI algorithm that processes all the data stored in electronic health records to predict the risk of organ failure before onset, therefore giving doctors a longer time window to intervene. And we package this into a decision support software that gives clinicians insights about their patients in real time so that they can administer life-saving treatments early. We developed and validated our system on the largest hospital dataset available from MIT, where the algorithm predicted the risk of multiple organ failures up to 48 hours before onset with an accuracy of 91%. Thereby changing the game from simply detection to prediction. And what makes our AI unique is the use of multimodal data, which includes medical images, textual reports, and vital signs. The issue, however, is that when we move from the world of research to the world of production, we notice that AI presents significant shortcomings when used in the medical field. And this is where my work mainly comes in. Firstly, we need to understand that in order to perform well, AI models require a large volume of labeled, structured, and balanced data. But access to such data is not always available. And secondly, patient privacy limits the amount of data that is available even further and makes the accessibility even more difficult. And finally, and most importantly, we have to realize that we live in a messy and dynamic environment where we cannot account for every possible situation. And the data might be available for some groups, but for other minorities, it might be scarce. So when we try to collect this data, we end up introducing biases just because our data was not diverse enough to begin with. And this can lead to dangerous ethical problems, especially in the healthcare sector where lives are at stake. So for example, if we have an algorithm that analyzes images of skin and we train it on images of predominantly white patients, but now we want to apply it on a broader, more diverse population, then it could potentially miss malignant melanomas in people of color. Moreover, the issue of privacy can also come under the umbrella of ethics. It is important for us to develop these medical AI models while securing the anonymity and privacy of our patients. And ultimately, our goal at Third Eye is to create the next generation of AI tailored for the use in healthcare, one that is fair, one that is secure, and one that does not necessitate large volume of data. One of the ways that we aim to achieve this is by producing our own synthetic data that doesn't create the inherent biases held within the data itself, and thereby obtaining a diverse and balanced data set that reflects the dynamic complexity of the real world. But what do we mean by synthetic data? We mean medical data that is completely fake and does not belong to any real patient. As an example, here you see a collection of faces, and all of these faces look like real people, correct? And some of them may even look like people that you already know. However, none of these people actually exist in real life. These images are all generated using AI. And similarly, we aim to produce medical data that is realistic yet completely synthetic. But in order to evaluate how good our model is at generating this synthetic fake data, we start with image data. And once we validate that our model performs well on images, we can then generalize it to the other data sources. But how can we generate realistic fake images? We do that using generative adversarial networks, or GANs for short. And the principle here is a simple two-player game. So we have two neural networks, the generator and the discriminator. The generator tries to fool the discriminator by generating images that look real, and the discriminator tries to distinguish between real and fake images. Hence, we understand the term adversarial and generative adversarial networks. And here we can actually think of the generator as an artist that is learning how to create real-looking images by sampling from random noise and outputting an image. At the very early stages of the training, the generator is actually really bad, kind of like a dog with a paintbrush. So in the beginning, we get abstract images that really look like nothing. So how do we train our generator to create good images that can actually fool us? Well, we don't actually have any way to tell if an image is good or not, mathematically speaking. And this is why we need another network, the discriminator network, to train our generator. The discriminator can be thought of as an art critic because its job is to examine the image that the generator creates, compare it with samples of real images, and determine whether it is fake or real image. And in the early stages of training, both networks are really bad at their jobs, but by competing with each other, the generator progressively becomes better at generating real-looking images, while the discriminator becomes better at telling them apart. And eventually the process ends when the discriminator can no longer distinguish real from fake. And this is when we know that we have good, highly plausible images. But ironically, GANs actually require at least tens of thousands of data samples to train, which makes them completely counterintuitive. So now we end up facing the same issue that we were trying to resolve initially, which is dealing with limited data samples. And the reason why GANs require so much data to train is to train the discriminator to classify images between real and fake so that we can later train our generator to generate realistic images. So we can actually resolve these issues just by modifying the AI training process so that we don't end up relying on a large volume of data. And instead, our GAN would potentially only need a handful of data samples to train. In contrast to good AI models, human, for instance, learn new concepts and skills much faster and much more efficiently. For example, kids who have seen cats and dogs only a handful of times can quickly tell them apart. Similarly, it is possible for us to design an AI model that is dynamic and capable of quickly learning new concepts and skills with only few training examples. And to achieve our goal, we use meta-learning techniques. And the idea of meta-learning is that instead of having AI learn to produce some output, it instead learns how to learn, making the AI more human. Therefore, instead of having a discriminator learn to classify whether our synthetic data is real or fake, we are really asking the question, what does our generator learn in order to produce the synthetic output? To put things back into context, the aim of GANs is to generate synthetic data, which we can then use to train the model that we intend on deploying on a real-world task like detection or prediction. And the reason why GANs require so much data is to train the discriminator to distinguish real from fake images solely for the purpose of training the generator. So the classification of real versus fake is secondary and completely unnecessary. So instead of just classifying whether something is real or fake, we can directly train the model that we intend on deploying on the fake data that the generator is producing to perform that real world task. And once trained on synthetic data, we test the intended model on a very small set of real data. Our generator can then be trained directly using the error of how badly the intended model performs in the real world. And eventually, our generator will be able to produce highly plausible images that can be used to train the models that we intend on deploying for real-world tasks. These are some of the results that we have obtained with chest X-ray generation. And here on one side of the screen, you see a collection of real images, and on the other side, you can see a collection of fake images. So I'm just going to give you a brief moment to try to tell which side is which. I hope I was able to fool you. So left is fake and right is real. We also tested this on brain MRI generation. Again, one side is fake and one side is real. Now, for me, as someone who knows nothing about biology, it's very hard for me to tell. Fake is on the right and real is on the left. More samples of MRI generation. Fake on the left and real on the right. So in a nutshell, we are creating a system that is fair and dynamic and able to adapt to the complexity of the real world. A system where we don't have to sacrifice privacy in order to innovate in AI. And once we expand to other data sources, we obtain a data-independent AI that can learn on the fly. Ultimately, we are creating the next generation of AI tailored for use in different types of healthcare applications, specifically organ failure prediction. This is the amazing team that is behind all of this work. So my colleague Dhruva and I are actually working together on developing the synthetic data generation models. And here we have our founder and CEO, Sam, and Marta, the physician on our team, who has been a great help in validating our results. Finally, I'd like to invite anyone who is interested in our work to join us, whether you are an engineer, a clinician, or an investor. Please find us on LinkedIn. And if you'd like to have any further discussions or ask any question or simply just connect, please feel free to link up with me via LinkedIn or contact me via email. And thank you very much, Science Innovation Union, for having me today. And thank you all for listening.
Thank you very much for that. That was really interesting. I got really into that game actually, trying to work out which was real. I'm going to very quickly share my screen again for everyone. So this is the QR code and the details for Pigeonhole. So just a reminder, if you want to go to that website and you can ask any questions, you can vote on any other questions that have been asked, and we'll be posing those to the panel at the end of the session. So next up, we're going to pass it on to Josep, who is a senior scientist at BenevolentAI. So I'll just stop sharing here. And if you want to take it away, please, Josep.
Thank you. Just give me a second. I'm playing around with my screens. Here you go. Can you see my screen?
Yeah, all brilliant.
Excellent. Great. So firstly, I'd like to again thank the Science Innovation Union for giving me the opportunity to give a little bit of a like an introduction to BenevolentAI and how we employ artificial intelligence models to propel and accelerate drug discovery. So again, just before I run into what we actually do and how we deploy artificial intelligence, I'll tell you again a little bit about myself. So I am Josep Monserrat. I am a senior scientist at Benevolent. I joined Benevolent on the week of lockdown, actually in March 2020 last year. And I'm working on data-driven target identification for a number of different diseases. I should have to say at the very beginning, I am not an AI scientist. I am actually a biologist by training. But at Benevolent, I do interact on a daily basis with all sorts of people with different backgrounds, like engineers, AI scientists, bioinformaticians, chemists, and of course, other biologists as well. So we're quite a diverse bunch of people working together. Before joining Benevolent, I obtained my PhD in cancer biology from the Francis Crick Institute. And prior to that, I also worked at Eli Lilly, where I was developing and establishing new in vitro models to better understand neurodegenerative disorders. So before we jump into what Benevolent does, I would like to highlight a couple of facts about traditional drug discovery and the recurrent problems that we've faced for many, many years now. So drug discovery is a very expensive and high risk undertaking. There's billions of dollars and pounds spent every year on R&D, and the actual cost of taking a drug to the market is estimated to be around $4 billion. And interestingly enough, even after spending all that money, around 97% of drug programs actually end up failing. Second main reason why traditional drug discovery is perhaps not ideal is the fact that it's very long. It can take up to 5 years from the time you decide to work on a particular disease to the time you actually get to clinical trials. And the overall pipeline from identification of what you want to work on and taking the drug to the market can take up to 12 years. And finally, there's a very poor efficacy and high societal cost. So you'd be surprised to hear that the top 10 selling drugs are actually quite ineffective, and there's a lot of non-responders patients. And more interestingly, there's a vast number of diseases that currently don't have any effective treatment. And therefore, that means that hundreds of millions of people around the world are actually suffering from a disease without a given cure. You can imagine how, with an aging population, this is actually causing a lot of strain on our healthcare systems across the globe. So why is it so difficult to come up with new drug targets for treating a variety of diseases? Well, there's three main reasons for that. First one is that human biology is an incredibly complex system. We are actually living, breathing big data systems made of billions and billions of cells, and after many years of evolution and permutations. So you can imagine the intricacies of biology, and whoever in the audience is a biologist themselves will know what I'm talking about. There's also a growing problem in biomedical research, and this is the fact that every day there's thousands of new publications on any specific biomedical research, and hundreds of millions of medical records being generated on a patient and clinical level data around the world. So it's practically become impossible for any given scientist to access all that information, digest all that information, and make inferences for how to best use this for drug discovery purposes. And finally, which is related to the first point that I made, there is actually quite a lot of unknowns in how many diseases actually work. And so perhaps one of the reasons why drugs actually end up failing in clinical trials is because we don't fully understand the precise molecular mechanisms and pathways behind any given indication. So this is where BenevolentAI comes in. So what we have done at BenevolentAI is we have created this entity called the Knowledge Graph, which is basically an entire repository of billions of entities and connections among those entities. Some of the ones are listed here that basically allow us to make inferences on practically anything we want to look into, basically, be it disease, be it pathway, be it chemicals, be it clinical data, whatever we were interested in, we can look at and see what it's connected to in the graph. So how it's generated, it's basically constructed of three main sources of data. On the one hand, we have unstructured data, which is basically the scientific literature, mainly based on scientific literature and its ingestion. Then we have the structured data, which comes from a lot of publicly available databases where you have relationships between diseases or genes or chemicals. And finally, we make use of, again, publicly available patient data, patient-level data, including clinical records. So combining all this information, we create the knowledge graph, which is actually therapeutic area and drug modality agnostic. And this is quite a mouthful, but what it basically means is that we can choose to work on any disease we want because the information is encompassed within the knowledge graph. And we can also try to tackle that particular disease with any driven drug modality, be it a specific small molecule or an antibody or a small oligo or whatever modality you want to try to look for. And so we can see the value of the knowledge graph and all the information it contains in one example I'll explain later. But the fact that we've generated this database actually allows us to work with a variety of partners through secure cloud deployments, one of which is AstraZeneca. So this is just to give you a brief snippet of how we ingest scientific literature. So one of the methods by which we construct this knowledge graph. So this is based on specific AI model called natural language processing. And so what it does is actually in charge of taking small sentences from scientific literature or patents or any other document that we may be interested in, and then trying to identify specific entities that will be either represented in our knowledge graph or that we want to represent in our knowledge graph. So in this case, we're looking at the sentence, SOD1 mutation causes ALS phenotype in human motor neurons. So what our models do is they identify the fact that this is an important entity and this is another important entity, in this case, a gene, and in this case, a disease. What we then do is we then take it one step further, and the NLP models actually find the link between these two entities. So in this case, this mutation causes ALS, and therefore we can make a directionality connection between these two entities in our graph. And this is just a very, very small example of how we can generate and ingest this scientific literature on a recurring basis. So now that we have created this knowledge graph, we can leverage it for making a number of inferences along the drug discovery pipeline. So not only do we use it for deriving the knowledge itself, like I've just described, but we also use it for identifying novel targets in diseases. We can also use it to try to stratify patients in a given disease that perhaps will react better or worse to a medicine. We can also use it to actually help us design novel molecules to treat these conditions. But with any given AI platform, there has to be a close-knitted interplay between human intelligence and the technology that has been created, just to make sure that it's interpreted in the correct way. So I'll now go on to talk about the case study that I was telling you about. So this is just a video summarizing how we create this knowledge graph live. So this is the work that we did last year on COVID-19. And as you can see here, some of the highlighted terms are these entities that we have in the graph. And as you can see, there's a lot of different arrows that connect these entities together to create the knowledge graph. So this pipeline development and the curation and maintenance of the knowledge graph has taken us around 5 years in deployment, in development. But we're now happy and freely interrogating this knowledge graph for a different number of biological relationships with as many as 24 entity types, some of which I mentioned before, like a given cell type or a given disease or a given pathway or a given compound. So what we have done is we've spent a long time trying to generate this massive knowledge graph. And now I'll tell you an example of how we leveraged it. So just in 48 hours over a weekend in January 2020, our team of AI scientists and biologists sat down and decided to look at our knowledge graph to see whether we could try to identify any potential drugs that are already FDA approved that we would find linked to COVID-19, so that perhaps we could repurpose that drug for the treatment of the condition. So interestingly, what we did is we actually identified a potential candidate called baricitinib, and baricitinib is an approved drug to treat rheumatoid arthritis, so a completely different disease that has nothing to do with COVID-19. So what we did is we quickly got in touch with Eli Lilly, who is the company that designed this drug. And together we set up a clinical trial to test the efficacy of our AI prediction. And by November 2020, we got accelerated approval for emergency use of baricitinib to treat COVID-19 patients. So you can see how it can relate back to the beginning of my talk when I said that it can take as long as 5 to 12 years from an idea to the clinic. And this is telling you that we did in around 8 to 9 months, we went from idea to actually treating patients for COVID-19. And I should say that we're very happy to receive some results earlier this month, where a phase 3 clinical trial showed that we can actually reduce mortality by 38% in patients that have been treated with baricitinib. But drug repurposing is not how we just use the knowledge graph designed at BenevolentAI. We obviously have a number of ongoing programs internally, some of which are summarized here and how far along they're in the pipeline of drug discovery. But also, as I mentioned before, we have ongoing collaborations with big pharma like AstraZeneca. And I myself am involved in the collaboration, trying to identify novel targets for chronic kidney disease. And again, we proudly announced earlier in the year that AstraZeneca has put forward their first AI identified target for trying to treat chronic kidney disease. And I was actually involved in that. So we get a very nice sense of pride to be involved in accelerating drug discovery. So I'd like to leave it here, and I'd like to finish with our motto, which is because it matters. We believe that there's no disease that should be left untreated or left unattained. So again, if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them after this session. And yeah, if you'd like to hear more about Benevolent, you can email hello@benevolent.ai, and we're happy to answer any questions you may have. So thank you.
Thank you very much. That was really interesting. I'm just going to share the screen again to bring up the pigeonhole details for everyone again. The questions are starting to pour in now, which is a really good sign. It means those first 2 talks are obviously getting some real stimulation in the audience, which is nice to see. So I'll flash this up for another 10-20 seconds if everyone wants to take the details down. But I'd also like to introduce our next speaker, which is Allison. Allison is the co-founder of Women Leading in AI, and she's going to have a really interesting talk for us as well. I'll stop sharing, and Allison, if you're ready to take over.
Thank you. Let me just share my screen. I have to share first, I'm afraid, because my computer has wonderfully decided to freeze. So hopefully this will work. Can you see everything okay, Chris?
That's the notes slide that we're seeing.
I knew it. Hang on 2 seconds then. So if I stop sharing again and try again. Right. You have to excuse me. Literally, as you started, I had problems. So
right. it can hear it. That's why it knows. The computer knows.
Oh, it knows. And I've done so many of these. Now, how are you doing? You should see a blank screen.
Yeah, it's your desktop.
Perfect. No, it's not. You should see my desktop. Right, from the beginning. Yeah.
Perfect.
All good. All right then. So thank you for your patience. Thank you, Chris. Happy to be here today, and thank you to the Science Innovation Union for inviting me. I'm Allison Gardner. I work at Keele University, lecturer in data science. I'm also heavily involved in standards setting for AI, and particularly in health tech. I'm a co-founder of Women Leading in AI, and I was also a biologist originally, And my PhD is how I segued into AI, because it was the in silico analysis of neurodegenerative diseases. So quite interested in Joseph's previous talk. I'm going to, as Kamar sort of talked quite well about data and biases within data, so I'm going to focus on some of the problems that you have with AI systems within healthcare. And she addressed the issue of bias within data, but I will say that bias can be injected at any point along the life cycle of an AI system in its development and its deployment. And this is the simplified diagram I've shown you here. And we'll talk about a couple of these examples in a second, but this is a generic slide I tend to use, which looks at all the issues that we have to deal with when we're looking at AI systems and what I would call safety critical decision making, which we have in healthcare, and how we need to really address and question ethics and fairness and bias at every stage of the process. So we'll go back to that on throughout the talk, but I'm going to focus very much on this section here about how we deploy and operationalize AI systems. So one example I mentioned about issues with bias within data, and again, it's not just about having unrepresentative data sets where you maybe have a majority white background ethnic groups and less people from other ethnic groups, and then you develop a biased algorithm. But it can also be based upon the features that you include, how you label them, and features you do not include, and the decision making and the value judgments around those. So here's a bed management algorithm that was in the news last year, I believe, and they found that this system, which was how and analysing patients' risk and need for an expedited pathway through to getting a bed and having this higher, quicker critical care. And so, in other words, measuring how sick they were and whether they should jump the queue. And they just found that this software was extremely biased, and it was developed, one particular algorithm was developed, and they actually were aware of algorithmic bias and had tried to correct for it. But what they didn't realize is one of the key features that the algorithm used to predict the degree of sickness of a patient was the cost of that patient. So this was in America. And because of societal biases, Black people tend to be sicker, and then they tend to have but they don't access it, so their costs vary compared to people from white backgrounds, and this created this bias. And actually quite a large number of patients who are much sicker than white patients, Black patients, much sicker than white patients, were being sent home. And of course, in healthcare, that can lead to death. So we have bias in systems, and it's not just within the data, but all the way through. Not understanding an AI system and how it's worked. This is particularly by people who are using the algorithm to make decisions in the real world, the actual users. And a well-known case I often talk about is a hip fracture diagnostic algorithm, which was very well balanced, and it involved using the image of the hip fracture from the scanners, but also clinical and operational information, because real world research showed that in a non-algorithmic system, combining that information actually produced better outcome in prediction. However, with the algorithm, what happened was it pretty much ignored the images. And basing, this was meant to be an image recognition tool on hip fractures. It ignored that and made its decisions on features such as the age of the patient and also what type of scanner was used. So if a mobile scanner was used, then it was more likely to predict that a fracture had occurred, which is fine unless you didn't know that that was the case, and unless in the system and you've been deploying the algorithm for 2, 3, 4, 5 years, and the operational system of the area decided we're not going to use mobile scanners anymore, but you're still going to use the AI system. So not understanding how that makes that decision is quite interesting. Recently, there's been a new algorithm that has addressed this issue and removed some of these features, and so it's much more focused on the image. So there are mechanisms to fix this. But I'm going to focus on skills phase. So this is all of these fixes that we know about and understand about in the AI ethics community, about data bias, about fairness testing, and ensure your metrics are safe and explainability, I'm going to talk about something that is almost post-algorithmic, and this is the issue of skills fade as attributed to healthcare systems. Skills fade is well established in other areas such as aviation. And this is well known because that is an industry that's had to deal with automation for much longer than you or I, in health tech as such. And so this is one example. This is a book called From Glass Cage by Nicholas Carr, highly recommended. And it references a number of situations as well as healthcare ones. But in the aviation industry, there's been a number of crashes that have been caused by the lack of skills or the fading of skills for pilots, because they haven't got the live flying skills that they used to have, because they become so dependent on automated processes, fly-by-wire, autopilots, and so on. And that usually is fine until there is a crisis situation and an error occurs. And this is where you get this disconnect between pilot skills and the automation, and hundreds and hundreds of people have lost lives because of crashes caused by this problem. So this is one example of the Colgan Air flight, where the pilot actually reacted incorrectly to a stall and the autopilot disconnected, and instead of reacting and going into a dive and descending to get the lift, they panicked, they had a stall, and they tried to actually increase on height, and that actually caused a plane to drop out of the sky, and 50 people lost their lives. And there's been a few more examples. So now the authorities have put in operational procedures to try and address this. So they've sort of said, in training for pilots, they must have a certain number of hours of live flying without an autopilot to make sure that they pass. So there's operational processes that they've started to incur. And I'd like to see those within the health and clinical setting. So here's another very quick example of one algorithm that I found quite interesting. This was published in Nature, and it was an algorithm that predicted a variety of diseases, and it was a classic one which had the prediction of this is better than, doctor's algorithm. It can predict disease better than, until you take a deep dive into the data and the results, and you find that yes, it did predict better than junior doctors and training doctors, but actually did not predict better than the experienced and expert doctors, which is the second groups here. So this was the algorithm at 0.885 F1 score, but as you see, the minute you get above a certain level, they are much better. So the question arises, well, if doctors become more dependent upon these algorithms for diagnostics, will they lose the ability and the nuanced skills that they need to do to actually diagnose correctly, in case there was a failure of the system? And also how they are influenced by the system. So this is another non-clinical use case of child welfare algorithms, and depending on how you design your human computer interface can influence the decision making of the clinician in terms of, I'm not sure I agree with this, but you've got a great big red risk score. Are they going to default to the algorithm themselves? And if it's a biased algorithm, that could be risky in itself. So having a human in the loop where they look at the algorithm and decide, oh yes, I'll agree with it, is not quite the correct method. And I view this as human in the loophole. So I have doubts and concerns about how we deploy AI systems in processes, but there's good news. There are methods now that you can use which will get the best of the AI system, best of the doctors and the clinicians without de-skilling them in the future. So this is one method, which is human algorithm integration, where the clinician will actually do the diagnosis first. So they do not look at the algorithm at all. They will then feed it into the system. That will come out with its own probability score and risk assessment and diagnosis, and combining the two actually has a better outcome than the clinician on their own or the AI system on their own. And it is a meaningful human in the loop that that is important. And it's important that they do this, they do the diagnosis first, so that they actually can retain their skills. And another algorithm, which was an X-ray and prediction algorithm, also proves that in the UK we have a 2-view system for scans. In the US they had 1-view scans, and they found that having a 2-view scan of the clinician making the diagnosis combined with the algorithm's diagnosis actually has a better outcome. So there are long-term consequences of automation within health tech if we're not careful, and that is that, you know, knowledge isn't lost. It lives in the few remaining specialist researchers in a database, but it's no longer added to. So we have to protect those skills. When we look to deploy these systems within the real life setting, we need to think about these long-term operational processes going forward. So I do have a call to action, really, in that we need to be aware of these wider aspects of how AI systems can have faults within them, but how we can mitigate for those faults. And just fixing the data isn't always enough. You need to look at long term. So guidelines and standards are being developed. So, you know, BSS and BSI 34971, which I'm working on, is an addendum to the risk management in medical devices standard. So they are being developed. Yes, we have NHS digital guidelines. I would like to see any healthcare and medical AI systems be treated as safety critical systems. So we do have clinical safety officers in the NHS, for example, which I would like them, you know, to have AI training. But also, as we go forward, medics need to have some training in AI so that they understand the positives, but also understand the risks and how to mitigate against them. So I hope I haven't overrun too much, and thank you for listening. And I will try and unshare now.
Thank you very much for that. That was really interesting. That was the unfortunate story of the plane crashes due to skill fade. My first thought was autonomous vehicles, as in cars on the road. I wonder if we're going to have any impact from that. Bit worrying, really.
Yep.
But we'll hopefully move on to a lighter note with Peter, who's the co-founder of Pexi. So Peter, I believe you're not sharing slides, so if you just want to take it away when you're ready.
Thanks very much, Chris. So no presentation on my side. I'm just going to walk you through a little bit of my background and a number of projects I've been involved in over the last few years. I'll try and keep it to just over 10 minutes so we can get into the questions. So I'm going to take a slightly different angle, less technical than the previous presentations. I'm currently not deep in the tech myself. I think Kamar and Josep, you guys did a really phenomenal presentation and some great detail. I'm going to follow a little closer to Allison footsteps. So thank you, Allison, and congrats on having such a clear desktop. I'm very impressed, actually. So a little bit of background. So going back to and figuring out how I landed up here, tech has always been quite a big part of my life. Since childhood, I've always been breaking something electronic, and quite quickly that led me into programming and mostly coding simple games. But I was always quite keen on the science and biology, and when genetics came about, that was a clear route for me, because obviously that's the earliest biological programming language there ever has. So I spent my first and early academic career in that field. There was lots of theory, but lots of time in the lab running experiments with only some very little bioinformatics at the time. The science was great, but soon realized that everything was very slow. You spend lots of days on end doing the same thing over and over and again with research, and you become incredibly specialized very quickly. So I stepped back and took a lateral step into medicine. After qualifying as a doctor, I spent years at various levels of care, from primary care all the way up to super specialist centers. Ultimately, I went on to do an MBA, and to pay for all of these degrees, I set up a number of tech businesses, some of which failed dismally, but some made it and some are still ticking over today. So at the moment, I'm really focused on building digital health tech that hopefully will play a role in the future of medicine. The type of medicine that I like is personalized, accessible, and scalable. So obviously big data and AI are huge enablers in these fields, especially when it comes down to stratifying patients. As a doctor, you're always pattern matching. From the moment a patient walks through your door, you start trying to figure out what disease or condition they're suffering from. But as humans, we can only keep and retrieve so much information in our brains. Additionally, we learn well from experience, but that means humans are never going to be very good at the holy grail of precision medicine, N of one medicine, where every patient is completely unique and is diagnosed and managed as one of a kind. So I don't touch much code anymore, but I'm very much involved in bringing that innovation in and delivering solutions that can take these AI and health tech into the real world. So over the last 5 years, I've been involved in 3 broad major projects here in the UK. The first project is a cancer genetics database. So actually starting at the side of the data, and that project is called COSMIC. It's a part of the Wellcome Sanger Institute. The second project is a medtech health company that is trying to solve some of the most difficult problems in rare diseases called Mendelian. And at current, I'm actually working at Tuune, which is previously Pexi, where we're looking to try and bring female hormones into the focus of mainstream medicine, which is an area that has been very badly neglected to date. I thought I'd spend a few minutes talking about each of these projects and just walk you through some of the learnings that I've learned through that, hopefully able to empower you guys with a little bit of practical knowledge, and hopefully you'll be able to take this forward quite pragmatically. So COSMIC, as I mentioned, part of the Wellcome Sanger Institute, is currently the world's biggest database of the genetics that happens within the cells, within cancer cells. And it really underpins most of precision cancer diagnosis, management, and even new drug development globally. So this is a source of data that all of AI in cancer really uses. And they kind of look at it for 2 main reasons. The first one, possibly closer to what BenevolentAI is doing, looking at pharma and early drug discovery. So they use the data in some incredibly novel ways to try and tease out connections between the current mutations that we know exist in this, what drugs will plug onto those mutations and make a difference, all the way through to just understanding how common some of these mutations are actually in the general population. And then all the way to the other end of the spectrum where health companies are using this data to really manage patients. So a good example of that, in fact, is Genomics England. If you look at a cancer report from Genomics England, they'll refer back to the big data that comes from COSMIC. Cancer is probably one of the main areas where precision medicine actually is performing at the moment. Moving on to Mendelian, rare diseases are a particularly interesting anomaly in medicine, actually. So independently, each of them are rare, but when you combine them together, 1 in 17 people will have a rare disease. So that's quite a staggering number and very difficult to deal with in medicine, because most of these diseases are quite hard to diagnose, very difficult to manage, and most doctors will never have seen even a fraction of them. Or in fact, if they do, they don't realize that these patients go undiagnosed. So at Mendelian, we built 2 major systems, and the first of which was a search engine, which basically took the patient's signs and symptoms, the phenotype, and generated a list of potential diseases and genes that could give rise to that clinical picture. Each of us have around 20,000 genes, but we only know what 25% of them actually do. So for this project, we had access to an awesome amount of data. We had animal models, biochemical pathway models, we had case studies. Some of these were in structured, some unstructured data sets. And we used all types of whatever we could get our hands on, from AI through to some complex natural language processing. And we created a very similar knowledge graph to what Josep was talking about a little earlier. We used this data to join the dots between the phenotypes and the genotypes and figured out what was driving these things independently. Additionally, we used AI to actually optimize the search engine that ran on top of that data. And we ran slightly different algorithms in different specialities. You know, if we worked in metabolic diseases, we noticed that the phenotypes were very close together, and we had to get a lot deeper and a lot more accurate into those particular areas. Ultimately, the results from this tool were spectacular. We conducted a trial where we compared 11 specialists, clinical geneticists, who had 2 weeks to go through about 100 cases. And we did the same thing in a matter of seconds, and we matched them. So as Allison was saying, came up about the same as the specialists, but that's still a phenomenal feat, especially if you think that you can get that across the world and democratize that into hospitals everywhere. The second system is also very neat. We use advanced pattern matching and AI on electronic records at scale to identify patients that should be tested for genetic diseases. So this system is a registered medical device in the UK and is currently searching through millions of patients in the NHS at the moment. And then lastly, as mentioned, Tuune, it's a company where we're looking at the impact of female hormones, and we're using technology to tease apart all of the mechanisms that drive that and working at an individual patient level. So our first product is geared at making personalized contraception making personalized recommendations for contraception. And many women across the world will know that they will at some stage have poor experiences with hormonal contraception. So we thought this was a great problem to tackle. It's a fairly new project, and we only launched the first version of this project into the wild very recently, and we're still busy testing it on a closed group for now. But the algorithms already take into account hundreds of variables, and as we bring aboard our hormone and genetic testing, of course, that number of variables is going to skyrocket. So I'm going to end up with just a few practical points that are quite key takeaways from what I've learned working in AI and health for the last few years. So, of course, we've all spoken around data. We all know that the complexities from this, but when it comes to access, the holy grail of AI and health data is really real world data. And that comes with its own challenges because it's quite tricky to get hold of that. I would say with the Mendelian project, it took us about a year just to get the paperwork done, to get access to the data that we needed to run the systems that we do. But fortunately in the UK, you've got some great biobanks that you can get data from. You've got big data sets of real world data like CPRD, which has SNOMED coded ontologies, SNOMED coded primary care data sets. You've got the HES database, which has tertiary care data sets. Beyond that, there's some great governmental organizations that you can get access to data through. So one of the good examples is HDR UK, Health Data Research UK. It's a phenomenal institute that will really give you access to pretty much any clinical data you're looking for, if that's imaging data, all the way through to data sets that I've mentioned already. And then, of course, volume. So a challenge, once again, at Mendelian, we were looking for rare diseases, and this is often like to looking for a needle in the haystack. But of course, in that circumstance, you need the haystack. So we needed really access to millions of patients worth of data. So that was obviously quite a challenge. And then quality, of course, a major aspect. I think one of the big key selling points of Cosmic is that data set has been manually curated over the last 20 years. And that's led to it being one of the gold standards. There's some new data sets of AI or machine learning data sets, generated data sets that have come up second just because of the deep, detailed, curated data that we have at Cosmic there. Of course, the biases that exist, I mean, in the real setting, we've seen this where we've applied some algorithms to populations in one geography of England and then tried to pull that across into another CCG in a different area and had totally different results. And turned out with a lot of deeper investigation, in the first geography, there was a population which had specific genetic background. So it really skewed some of the learnings we got from that. And then just moving on to the algorithms, I think it's quite easy, being excited and jumping straight into generating these very technical and advanced machine learning algorithms, but it's pretty useful to not over-engineer in these circumstances. So in many cases, you can start off with some simple rules-based mechanisms and then start building up into some more complex mathematical modeling and then moving eventually into some of these more advanced machine learning aspects. As soon as you get a little bit too far down that spectrum, you end up really clashing heads with regulators and things like that. So a lot of what you've seen today, we'll be talking around things that are quite advanced and very difficult to get through regulation. So that kind of segues me into the regulation aspect. This is a piece of the puzzle that you absolutely can't forget about. And I would suggest strongly, if any of you are thinking of going in this direction, to get to grips with how the regulation works from early. Because as soon as you understand how you can work within the regulation, you can start adapting your plans to get something through. It's really incredibly frustrating to get to the end of a project and then try and get it regulated, only to find that it's incredibly tricky to try and get something through that you've planned. So just as a quick point on that, the regulation starts off by looking at the safety of your system. So it looks at, one, the impact. Is it dealing with something that's critical, serious, or what they classify as non-serious? And of course, the more critical, the higher the level of regulation. And secondly, then it moves on to the immediacy. How immediate is the impact of what you're doing? So if you're dealing with something that, a good example would be, is delivering glucose into a diabetic patient, but actively at that moment of things. So it's something plugged on, monitoring the levels, and then delivering glucose. Of course, that can lead to death very quickly if something goes wrong. So the immediacy of that is very high. So you're going to be very highly regulated. Beyond that, the question comes down to, what is the system actually doing? Are you driving clinical care or are you informing? And if you're driving clinical care, of course, more regulated, informing, going to be less regulated. Ultimately, the last question they're really going to be interested in is, who is the user? If the user is a patient, it needs to have a higher level of quality control than if the user is going to be a healthcare professional. So as Allison was mentioning, that's where the human in the loop comes into play. So if there's an external risk mitigation process that you can shift some of that risk to, you're going to be ending up in a slightly lower level of risk, and you're going to be easier to get through some regulation. So as mentioned, the regulation is really quite onerous, but it's set up to be very positive. Of course, it's very protective over us as patients ultimately, but it's a slow process. Just lastly, going to end up with mentioning there's a foundation called PhD, the PhD Foundation, which is based in Cambridge, as part of Cambridge University at the moment. They do a huge amount of advisory work for Public Health England, the NHS, and other bodies like that. They've published recently a number of reports on AI in health, black box medicine, and transparency and regulations. But I think a good way to think about actually getting new products and tech, digital products through regulation is to try and put them back onto the old school mechanisms of how you would actually get a drug approved. So traditionally, you would have to do trials to get these things verified and validated. And similarly, you would need to do that type of thing. And in fact, quite often when dealing with something that's black box, you can find precedents in the drugs at the moment still. I mean, even to date, we still do not really understand how paracetamol works or all of the details of how metformin works. So, it's not abnormal to have black box type medicine. It just means you need to go that extra mile to go and verify it, prove that it works, test it on different populations and things like that. So ultimately, it all comes down to then the big difference between these traditional things like drugs versus tech is how quickly things can change in tech. So really delivering products, you need to make sure that it's consistent. There are a lot of quality controls, and you don't ever release anything into the wild without ticking all those boxes. So I'm going to end there and hand it back to Chris, but I am going to say one last thing. We definitely are hiring scientists and data scientists at Tuune. So if anyone's interested, please connect with me afterwards. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much for that. It sounds like a really varied career. I imagine if we had more time, you'd probably go for quite a lot with that. So thank you very much. And thank you to all our speakers. This brings us to the panel discussion, and the Pigeonhole has got a lot of questions in there, which is really good. There's obviously a lot of questions in the audience. It's not too late to join and go on to that. So what I'll do is I'll share my screen again with the information. And if you want to go to that website, you can vote on any questions that you're interested in or pose your own. And with that, I'm going to pass it on to our co-chairs, Sean and Tia. If you want to take it away, please.
Sure. Thank you, Chris, and a big thank you to our speakers for the great talks. Now we have a chance for some indirect audience participation. So I'm Sean from the SIU's editorial team, and I'll be moderating the question and answer session with Tia, who is also from the SIU editorial team. We will be asking the questions that have come through so far on the Pigeonhole. So please do keep posting and voting on that forum. The link is in the chat. So the first question is for Kamar. People are very curious to find out what the plans are for third eye intelligence moving forward, and when you guys might even be doing some clinical trials or even start getting the technology into hospitals.
Thank you very much for this question. So right now we have secured 2 of the largest hospitals as partners, in particular Chelsea Westminster and UCL NHS Trust. And we plan to move forward. With alpha clinical trials around September time. Can you hear me? I don't know why the screen just went away. Sorry. So anyway, yeah, we plan to move forward with clinical trials around September time, and we are also interested in looking for more partners, as it is likely that we want to do a multi-center trial to study biases arising from population. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much. Next question from Tia.
Yes, so the next question is for Josep. So scientific research is often flawed. So how do you prevent what some AI engineers might call rubbish in, rubbish out?
That's a very good question. And it all depends on how you define rubbish. But to answer this question, I guess I can say that no man works alone at the company. So it's not like the AI engineers go there, they do the natural language processing, generate the graph, and then that's it, job done, on we go. It's actually quite an interdisciplinary environment. So we ensure that we strive for quality with everything we do. And we have a lot of actually groups designated to testing the quality of the knowledge graph itself and also of the predictions that it makes with our models. And ultimately, where I get involved, for example, as a biologist, is to ensure that we put the predictions generated by the models into the biological context, ensuring that they actually make sense given the pathology and the mechanisms. And then ultimately the real test comes when you do experimental validation. So that's when you get most of the answers back. And then you can close the loop by feeding that data back into the graph and informing it about what went right and what went wrong.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, yeah, so the next question is going to be directed to Allison. Do you think that it's plausible that AI algorithms will be integrated into public health services like the NHS eventually? And given that there is a current reliance on outdated manual approaches?
Yes, and they already are, to be honest with you. So and have been for a while. And my concern is that's great, but that the earlier ones are being deployed with really not much controls or awareness of the operational procedures that they need to do. I think we're all fairly up on data bias now, but it really does. Some of my apprentices at Kiel work in the NHS, and when I do lectures with them, I get messages going, oh my goodness, Allison, we're using someone, we've had them for ages, and it really worries me. And it's not always the obvious ones. It's not always sort of the diagnostic ones, which tend to get most of the front pages, but there are other ones, with management systems as well, and communication systems that can cause problems. There's a lot of push for electronic medical records, and there's a lot of benefits for those. But again, there can be risks with those if they're not deployed correctly, especially depending on how they're made, because if they're made by voice recognition, you have problems between male and female voices even now. So yes, they already are, and are increasingly so. I'm on the AI award panel for the grants, and the number of grants coming in, it's very competitive field, and so we'll get more and more of them.
Great, thank you. Tia, next question.
So this question is for Peter. You mentioned you had some unsuccessful ventures. Could you give us an insight into how you continue to stay motivated?
That's a good question. I think it's sometimes just sheer pushing through the negatives. I think you get into a position where you just have to keep going forward, and a little bit of desperation goes a long way when you're an entrepreneur. And I think once you've had one failure and you end up having the next one, but a few successful along the way, you kind of realize what everyone says, and that is that as an entrepreneur you have to be willing to fail, and that's very, very true. So I would say if anyone is going to go in the entrepreneurial direction, walk into it knowing that there's a very good chance that you're going to fail, but make sure you learn a lot in the process.
Great, thank you.
Okay, the next one is actually, we'll open it up to everyone. So what do you think, it's a very general question, what do you guys think is the next kind of upcoming big topic in this field, in AI and health tech? What's going to be making the most impact in the next few years? And maybe if we can start with Josep.
Yeah, I think there's room for AI in pretty much every stage of healthcare. So I would say we could even use it for diagnosis, like actually Kamar was talking about. We could also use it for drug discovery, like what Benevolent is doing. We could also even use it for trying to predict recurrence of a given disease when it's going to come back. So I think we could apply AI as it is, and I'm pretty certain it will continue to grow in pretty much every stage of healthcare. And you can even think about not just the actual biologicals, but there's also involvement now, you know, there's big data, so we can use things like Fitbit trackers, for example, to make predictions on, you know, I think there's now data on whether someone is bound to develop some sort of degenerative disease based on how much they sleep, for example, based on these trackers, and much more information. So I think there's room in pretty much anything can brainstorm about. So again, if there's any entrepreneurs in the call and you have a great idea, I would encourage you to go for it.
Thanks very much. Could I rope in Kamar if you have a comment on that?
Yes, thank you. So I think what Josep said pretty much is correct. I think mainly predictive technology is going to be, the main focus, because now we are trying to provide support for clinicians. We are not trying to take over the clinician's job. We just want to make sure that we offer the clinician enough support to make decisions early, so that we can prevent any further complications from happening. And also, on a completely different side, I think that assistive devices for people with disabilities are going to be on the rise. They are already on the rise, but I think the future is going to be even bigger for that.
Okay, thank you very much. Allison, would you like to pass comment?
Yes, I will. I mean, just as Josep said, it's going to come in every field. I think one interesting one might be about sort of remote management of healthcare will be increased. For example, the use of wearables, integration with voice assistants such as Alexa. If I've upset anybody's Alexa off, I'm so sorry. And that might occur. And there was one good example of how integrated with your Alexa can actually order your insulin for you, arrange the Uber to come and drop it off at your door, and it sort of circumvents all that process. So I think we might see more of that. Again, I will always advocate the fact that we need to be very careful about how we use them to make sure. And I'll go back to what Kamar said. Yes, absolutely, you're not trying to replace clinicians. You're trying to augment them and democratize it. As I think Josep or Peter, might have said, to areas where there aren't clinicians, but the business managers in hard cash-strapped organisations such as the NHS might not have the same viewpoint, and there is evidence that use of these systems can cause people to remove the expensive experts and actually downgrade positions. So you do have to be careful. So this is why we have to have this dual approach that I talked about.
Thank you very much. Yeah, definitely some perspective there.
If I may add to that, I think there's, just to follow on Alison's point, there may be a boom in a whole new suite of jobs we can't even think of at the moment, right? There will be a lot of new technologies that will be developed that we can't even conceive at the moment. So I think that it's not like we're going to end people's jobs. We're going to create new ones, if anything, right?
So we'll just pass on to Peter if he wants to comment on this question, and then we can move on to the next.
Thanks, Sean. I think the answers already have been pretty good. I mean, I must say this is something that it's going to touch every area. I think one thing I can say is that what we are possibly going to see is very interesting advances within the clinics. And if you look at the tech companies, there's quite a bit of interesting movement right now. Google Health has taken a very deep clinical route. If you look at the validation that they've done within the hospitals in London, looking at kidney failure and things like that. So it's really hard clinical work, whereas Apple, on the total opposite other end of the spectrum, has gone completely direct to consumer with quite clinical things. So I think we're going to see that coming together in a big way, and there's going to be more people entering in from both sides. So I'm quite interested to see how that plays out as things come. But I think the immediate effect we're going to be seeing within practice already is the stuff where we have human in the loop modulating all of that. So you're going to get augmentation of processes in the hospitals. And that's where all of the stuff that I've been working on the last 5 years has really come to fruition. It's stuff that's happening today in medical practices.
Great, thanks so much. It was super interesting. Tia, next.
So this question is for Allison. What could companies or society do to encourage more women to get involved in AI?
Change the question. What can companies and society do to stop an industry being colonized by men? This sounds really combative, and this is where the arms get folded. We have been addressing this problem with lack of diversity within tech for decades, and where other sectors have actually improved their representation, we have in effect almost gone backwards. In fact, there's some evidence that we're actually getting worse, not better, because there is pushback. And I think we need to convert the spotlight from, well, what do women need to do to be more confident, to stay in tech, to access them? Let's do that, absolutely. But we need to look at the other side of the coin. This is why have we created an industry that has been such a safe space for a particular type of person, and why do they flourish when others don't? And I think we need to look at that types of behavior as well. And absolutely, I was thrilled to hear about Peter focusing on women's health, because when you do not have diversity, you miss complete loads of use cases. 50% of the population isn't catered for. Whole use cases, whole areas of health are not even addressed because it doesn't even occur to people. And if they are addressed, they're addressed in the wrong way, putting sort of male sort of value judgments on certain features, and they get them wrong. We see that in tech all the time. So Peter's focus on that is so welcome, because women die because of this.
Yeah, I'll quickly add a point on that, Allison. Actually, it's when I started to get involved in women's health, one of the facts and statistics that really shocked me was how many drugs that have been approved by the FDA were not once tested on women, female cells, or even female animal models, because the complexity of the menstrual cycle just skewed all of the data. So they just ignored it and excluded it. It's really frightening. I mean, to think that half the population is treated with medication that has never been tested at that population, within that population, it's frightening.
Okay, thank you for that. Sean, with the next question.
Sure, thanks. Just another question to Josep. Just a question about how the knowledge graph works. Maybe you can't tell us because it's like proprietary, but obviously there's more reliable information out there, there's less reliable information out there, even in scientific journals. What kind of curation is performed on the information as it's being kind of read in through the knowledge graph?
Yeah, I would say I'm not the most adequate person to speak about that because I'm a biologist for training, like I said at the beginning. But I'll just add that, like I mentioned before, we have quite a number of groups formed by AI scientists, biologists, and bioinformaticians that make sure that the data that is being ingested is properly responding to how the models were trained. And one way in which perhaps you can do this is you take a very well-known pathway in a very well-known disease, and you make sure that after ingestion of certain sets of data, the predictions are still correct, correctly directing to those very well-known pathways. And that's sort of a sanity check that we often do to ensure that the data that we're putting in is not biased in any given way.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Follow-up question for Josep, actually. What are the types of career progression available for someone from a biology background that is thinking of going into AI healthcare?
Yeah, and that's a very good question, and one I asked myself when I joined the company. So now that I've been there for a year, it's clear that you get opportunities to go in whichever direction you want. I think at Benevolent, there's quite an open culture, and people try to help you go in any direction you may be interested in. So, for example, you could go up the managerial route where you will be given more responsibilities to lead projects, to take care of teams, and sort of climb up the ladder in that manner. But there's people who prefer to stay put in doing the biology and the thinking behind the assays and the experimental validation, while there's people who choose to perhaps go down the AI route. And, you know, we have obviously support to train you in any bioinformatics you may be interested in. And, you know, so you can follow pretty much any path you may be interested in. It's down to what you prefer.
Great, thank you.
Okay, next question is for Kamar. how does your AI distinguish different diseases that are occurring in the same organ? And thus, how does it figure out when a transplant may be needed? This could be for lung cancer or COPD. This is the question.
So in my presentation, I focused more on the image data that we're using, simply because I'm a computer vision engineer. But our prediction system uses all types of data. So we have an NLP module that analyzes the radiological reports, as well as medical notes, which then allows us to make the predictions. So this is how we can differentiate.
Peter, you mentioned that it's frustrating having projects blocked due to regulation. So would you be able to give us an example of the type of project that could be blocked?
Sure. I think a good example, well, there's always the classic example of 23andMe trying to tackle genomics reporting for health. That was blocked obviously for some time, but that's an area that I suspect there's going to be a lot of misunderstanding or at least lack of experience seeing systems like that. I mean, all of the regulators are pretty good at approving things they've seen before. So if they've seen the same sort of study, they've seen you've done it and you've ticked all the boxes, then it's good. Where it stumbles is innovative tech, and innovative healthcare really flummoxes these regulators because they're not quite sure what controls to put on them or how they work. So that takes a long time. If you try and approach the FDA with something novel, you end up with what they call a de novo application. And that means you need to start from scratch and absolutely walk them through every step of the way and show them everything. And that can take months, if not years. So it's a bit of a double-edged sword being innovative in healthcare. It's quite a tricky one. And in fact, I think one of the things that I've done best with all of the companies that I've been involved in is figure out how to get into the healthcare setting with something that's dumbed down. So you dumb down your technology to get it through regulation, to get in, get access to the data, start working and gaining the trust. And then on the back of that, you can retrospectively validate your technology on the data. Of course, you need to have the right data sharing principles in place for that. But once you've got access to that data, you can go back and start validating and then step through the regulation. So it's a very good trick if you are trying to get into that game.
Can I just jump in?
Sure.
As somebody who advocates for regulation and writing in standards, a common complaint is well, two common complaints is that regulation inhibits innovation, where actually there is evidence that actually good regulation done well can actually enhance innovation. And also the point is that this is to encourage safety. In the rush to do AI, we're seeing errors made that result in patient death. I'm not being dramatic there. So that is one thing to have to consider. But it's the same way of working together, working people like Peter, working with the regulator to talk them through is really important. So I don't want regulation to be seen as a bad thing, but it's how it's done. And often is the case is really, really important.
Actually, thanks, Allison. I'm going to make a point that so in the last 5 years in these projects, I've really only been involved in the regulation aspect for 2 years. And that's why I mentioned that it's really quite positive to get involved in regulation early. And I agree, actually, Allison, what you say. Now that I understand how the regulation works, I really appreciate it because it really is quite structured and well thought through, and it's really about quality. I think it has made us more innovative in the way we're delivering it, and definitely much safer. So it's not something to be scared of or to try and stay away from, but I think understand it and work with it is definitely the right way to tackle it.
Great. I mean, just staying almost on the same topic. There's a lot of concern about data becoming more commoditized now, and how do you feel that this might impact the AI in healthcare sector? If we could start with Peter, actually, and then whoever else wants to jump in, please feel free.
So I think this is naturally going to progress anyway, and what we'll see is that the value of certain types of data is going to start going down because it is becoming commoditized, where we're going to get huge amounts of it. I mean, as we know, the price of genetic sequencing really is going down. And suddenly, now we're dealing with so much more data on that front than we have done previously. And of course, that's going to accelerate exponentially. So that value of that particular little set of data is going to get lower. But actually what Josep said is really valuable in this setting when you start bringing data sets together, when they start working together and connected. I mean, many of you in this room will probably be very familiar with the FAIR principles of data, but as soon as you start playing out these FAIR principles of data and the ability to connect data sets together, that's really when you start generating value. I mean, I think we're always going to have this conversation of who owns the data, and is it the individual's data or the people who collected its data? We'll see how that plays out in due course. But I think that the position we're in right now, that this data has value, is actually driving a huge amount of this innovation, because realistically, medicine is a very difficult place to make money unless you're selling drugs. Diagnostics, companion diagnostics, sadly, it's very tricky to get those monetized. So those individuals who are working in those spaces are actually generating data to develop more drugs, and then that data ends up at BenevolentAI, etc. So it's an interesting flywheel, and this closed loop that Josep was talking about is, in fact, it's a very big loop that a lot of these things take.
Yeah, and I can just follow on naturally from this. I could also say that if any data becomes a commodity in the future, that actually opens doors for the rare diseases for which there's very little data, right? So in fact, yeah, we take this quite seriously at Benevolent, and we have we have a data-driven data diversity initiative that tries to ensure we cover things like ethnicity and sex and other sort of variables that are very much disregarded in the current models and sort of data used for AI.
I think one of the problems, I'll be very quick, as Kamar mentioned privacy, so you might want to add on to that, is the issue about privacy and who controls the data. And when you're talking about aggregating data sets, even if you have what you think is an anonymized data set, the minute it becomes aggregated, it can be what's the opposite of re-anonymized? I'm not sure, but you can be identified through that one. So it's this idea of trust and which actors. So when DeepMind got its health data, and then said, oh, don't worry, the agreement is it's only going to stay with DeepMind, and then DeepMind then restructured, didn't they, with Google and stuff, and then and that data was off. But that's a difficult challenge, because I think it's the trade-off with the individual and their citizens' rights, but also I think people are quite aware that the data's out there. And when we looked at the COVID tracing apps, for example, most people go, well, Google have got your data already. It's that horse has bolted. So I think we need to be realistic now, I think, about weighing up the risks and benefits of selling our privacy in that way. So I don't particularly have an answer, but I actually think it's too late.
I have nothing to add to what the panel said. I mean, everything they said is true. And all of these issues is exactly why at Third Eye, we are trying to move away from data, and we are trying to become completely data independent.
Thank you very much. Yeah, Tia, if you'd like to.
This question is open to all members of the panel. So what are the key challenges or obstacles that are often associated with AI and healthcare application from your personal perspective? If you could start, maybe Josep.
Yeah, I think that some of the ones that are very obvious we've already talked about. So some of the challenges will be, I think, mainly data accessibility and data diversity. So, I mean, I'm no one to speak after Peter's words on how little represented women are in all these clinical trials. So I think these are the main challenges that we need to work on as a community moving forward.
Does anyone else have anything to add? Allison, Peter?
I always have things to add. I'm sorry, Peter went there. Yes, I think it's the lack of AI-specific regulation. I think it's also a lack of processes by which we can operationalize the ethical principles that we have attributed to AI now, which is very, very difficult to do. And also, it still surprises me, is the lack of training and knowledge of end users on the processes of how AI systems are developed and deployed, including the management as well as the actual clinicians using it. As we know, people like me have known about the problem with women in healthcare for years, and I'm still deeply surprised when I go to conferences and I say something and I still see the shocked faces and I go, really? So it's hard to educate and train.
I would say that one of the big challenges that we have here is this crowd is obviously comes from a very technical background, and trying to get it into the clinic is difficult because things don't work like you think inside the clinic. You know, the pathways that patients go down, or these standard procedures that happen in the clinics and hospitals it's difficult to get something in there unless you understand them deeply. So I think integrating and exposing the crowd that we have here into those sectors is really useful. So NHS has some great, they've got NHSX where they really are trying to bring in some AI and things like that. But I think there needs to be a lot more integration and cross-pollination of these principles. I think even just, you know, if anyone in this room is really interested in getting into this, try and figure out how you can go and spend time with a doctor that's working on these things, or understand what happens, or how the patients flow through the system is really the key, and who's paying for it and how they're paying for it, because of course that's a big driver. You know, we have a complex health system in England and the UK, with the NHS paying for various things through all sorts of channels, and that understanding those payment gateways will unlock the way that these things get adopted eventually.
Do you have anything to add, Kamar?
I mean, the experts covered everything. I have nothing to add.
Great, thank you.
All right, guys. Well, thank you so much for that wonderful discussion. We are unfortunately out of time, so I will throw over back to Chris to wrap us up. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Sean. Thanks, Tia. Yeah, unfortunately, that is all the time that we have, but the fact that we pushed it right to the limit is obviously a really good sign. Some really interesting topics there, definitely some differing opinions as well, which I always quite enjoy as an audience member. I just want to thank our speakers again one more time. Thank you very much for giving us your time this evening. It's really appreciated. Thanks go to the SIU team as well that's been working hard to put this event together, and to all the audience members for coming tonight. The recording will go on YouTube in the coming weeks, so if you want to go back and look at it, you will have that opportunity. I'm just going to share my screen again. So if you want to keep up with what the SIU are doing, please do follow us on social media. We'll have announcements on there for future events, article releases, and all that really good stuff. Other than that, thank you very much, everybody. If we can ask the audience members to please close your Zoom accounts and have a really good evening. And the speakers, if you want to stay behind, and we'll have a little chat and thank you.